Well, let me ask you, do you remember when you learned to walk? Probably not. I had the great opportunity of being there when Solomon put all the pieces together. He stumbled at first, and then he took a few steps, and then he seemed to get it. And so he hasn't stopped walking since. And I'm willing to bet that the same was probably true of you as well, as evidenced by the fact that you walked in here this morning. Do you remember when you learned to ride a bike? Probably, yeah. I remember. You probably, if you were like me, you fell a couple times. It was hard to learn, but once you did, you haven't looked back since. And even if you haven't ridden the bike, again, like me, for 10 years, it's probably something that you continue in, that you still know how to do. After all, they don't use the phrase, it's like riding a bike, for nothing. Right? You still have it. You still live within the reality of bike ridingness, if that's a word. The point is, even though there are certain moments where you learn to walk, learn to talk, learn to ride a bike, even learn to drive, it's not simply an event of the past. The fact is, you live in the present reality of walking and talking and bike riding. It's something that you're engaged in right now. And it's the same with the celebration that we're doing today, the celebration of Pentecost. Celebration comes around, this event comes around every single year. And it's easy to think that we are just remembering something long ago, something of the past. And it's a novelty to wear our red shirts. But Pentecost, rightly understood, is not simply a memory. It's a reality that we are invited to presently participate in. The descent of the Holy Spirit that we heard in the book of Acts, the filling of the disciples, and the empowering of the church to go out into the world is something that we live in our Christian life today. If you want to follow along, I invite you to pick up your pew Bibles and turn to Acts chapter 2. That's in the New Testament, so it's in the second half of the Bible. It's right after the stories that talk about Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then you'll find the book of Acts. Now, as I normally do when I think about, kind of what I'm going to be saying today, I reflect on the passage, I pray about it, I meditate on it, and I think about, who's going to be gathering on the day. God knows who's going to be here on a certain day, so I pray about that. And while I do that, I reread the passage over and over again. It's quite a lengthy process. And so I was doing that this week. And I found it, and then it hit me. I found it interesting. I found it inspiring when I looked down to verse 1. And verse 1 says this: "When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place." Does that describe anything familiar to you? It's not a trick question. I'm not thinking about some obscure Bible reference that only I know. I'm not thinking about that. In a very real way, verse 1 describes what we did about half an hour ago. Right? The day of Pentecost has come. And we're all together in one place. It's a reality that we participate in. It's not just a memory, it's not just an isolated event disconnected from our lives. It's the empowerment of the church, the Spirit of God coming to us all and calling us out into the world. And the dwelling of God's Spirit remains with us. The visitation of God to us through His Spirit isn't just a flyby. It's not just a one-shot event. The Spirit comes, the Spirit dwells, the Spirit fills. So as we read this, about the falling of the Spirit and the tongues of fire, we are called to think about ourselves in our life here. For example, verse 2, "Suddenly a sound like a blowing in a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each one of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit. They began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them." What does it mean? for the place to be filled with the Holy Spirit? Do we see this here? Do we acknowledge this here? We hear in our reading that the Spirit comes and fills the entire house. There is not one corner of that place which is not touched by God's presence, which creates an interesting question. Is that here? Pentecost is a reality that we are invited into as a church, so that we're not just a bunch of like-minded spiritual people, but a community of faith seeped in the presence of the Spirit. How is the Spirit here in this place, filling our halls and our rooms? Do we have a sense of God's presence here? Have you ever walked into a place and gotten a feeling about it? You walk in and it feels comfortable, it feels warm, you feel at ease, it just kind of, it seems peaceful. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you've walked into a place and you just kind of get creeped out. Have you ever had that experience? 3.5 years ago, Alicia and I looked at a whole lot of houses to find which one we wanted to buy. And there were several that we walked into and we got creeped out. This is not the place for us. It looks nice. Everything kind of seems in order, but it kind of creeps us out. We respond to some feeling there. In our reading, the Spirit falls on the place where the people are gathered, and it was tangible. People could feel the presence of God. Do we feel the presence of God here? Now, I'm going to be honest and say that I do feel God's presence. And it's not just because I get paid to say that. I actually do believe that and feel that. Last week, we talked about how people in our community are experiencing answers to prayer. People have come and they've said to me, we talked about that last week, people have come since then and told me how they have received answers to prayer, that they've been praying, sometimes for a little thing, sometimes for a really big thing. Somebody after the 8 o'clock service said, I've been praying for a really big thing, and it's been answered. One of the things that I've noticed over the past couple months here is that during our peace times, where we exchange the peace of Christ and everybody stands up and sometimes shakes each other's hands, there's a whole lot of more hugging going on. Have you noticed that? I have. Now, one of the reasons why I've noticed that is because Alicia and I are not huggers by nature. That's not our temperament. But there's a lot more hugging going on. And it seems like the Spirit is creating friendships and bonds between people, bringing people together. Again, I talked to someone after the 8 o'clock service who responded to kind of the sermon and said, I feel God's presence here. She came last winter on kind of a church shopping run and came here and thought, this is nice, but then went on to other places, but could never get this place out of her mind. There was a sense that she was being drawn here, that there was something about this place that she responded to, that she could feel. God's working here. I'm sure you have your own experiences of that. I'd love to know them. Because the thing is, when the Holy Spirit descends at Pentecost, it's not about the place. It's not just to create a very windy room, like God just turned on the fan. The disciples are filled. The Holy Spirit fills the entire place